I pay my respects to the traditional custodians of the land and to people living with disabilities, including the neurodivergent, their families, carers, and supporters. So, is a late ADHD diagnosis real? In its simplest form, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder is true to its name. However, there are 3 subtypes of ADHD. There are those that experience predominantly attention deficit symptoms. There are those that experience predominantly hyperactivity and impulsivity symptoms. And the 3rd subtype are those individuals that experience both these forms of symptoms. Globally, up to 7% of people have been diagnosed with ADHD. Just last week in Australia, the government released figures indicating that for adults, up to 6% of Australian adults have been diagnosed with ADHD. And interestingly, up to the age of 20, 1 in 10 individuals could have or have been diagnosed with ADHD. ADHD is actually the most common childhood disorder. Also, these strained figures indicated that as high as or as many as 3 males receive a diagnosis to 1 female. To be diagnosed with ADHD, the DSM-5 specifies that you have to have a minimum of 6 symptoms that are persistent pattern of symptoms, and that these symptoms occur for a minimum of 6 months, and that these symptoms interfere with functioning and development in at least 2 settings, and also that the symptoms can't be better described by an alternative disorder. And importantly to this presentation, the DSM-5 specifies that the symptoms need to be present before the age of 12. So what causes ADHD? Well, it's actually a complex mix of both environmental and genetic factors. In as many as 80% of individuals that have ADHD, they do run genetically in up to 80% of families. Also, ADHD is associated with structural and functional brain abnormalities, specifically in the production of dopamine. And also, it could be summarized in executive functioning, which is represented in goal setting, planning, doing tasks, and also completing tasks. Another risk factor is actually low birth rate and early births. Across the lifespan, ADHD can be debilitating. For young children, it could mean that there are delays in physical coordination, speech and language, and also hyperactivity. For adolescents and adults, things like social disability, substance abuse, unplanned pregnancy, suicidality. Regardless of when ADHD is diagnosed or the symptoms first appear, whether it be child or beyond the age of 12, ADHD is associated with premature death. So if the symptoms occur after the age of 12, is it real ADHD? In 2022, Ringland and Associates asked the same question. They wondered if late ADHD and child ADHD actually was the same disorder. And they wondered if it was the same disorder, do childhood resources delay the symptom onset, or is it an alternative disorder? The purpose of this paper is actually to focus on the first question. If it is the same disorder, do childhood resources delay the onset? So to answer this question or this hypothesis, the researchers used data that has been recorded and collected since 1991 in England, and it's data that's been produced by both parents and children. There's almost 15,000 participants in this longitudinal research. However, relevant to this particular study, the amount of participants ranged from 4,000 to almost 10,000. To answer these questions, The researchers looked at limitations that had taken place previously, and they decided that they would use two different types of ADHD questionnaires and that they would operationalize ADHD, which means they would measure ADHD in two different ways. And that also the people that would answer those questionnaires were both the parents and the individual themselves, what's called a self-report, and those individuals answered the questionnaires at 25 years of age. The parents also answered those questionnaires when the individual was 25 years of age. They looked at risk factors, genetic and both birth. They looked at cognitive abilities that were reflected in verbal and reading abilities, and they looked at those childhood resources. The results indicated that when self-reporting, so these individuals that answered the questionnaire at age 25, 96% of those individuals and 89% of parents that were answering on behalf of their child indicated that ADHD symptoms actually held off until early adult and did not begin in childhood or adolescent. These results also indicated that females were more likely than males to develop ADHD later in life. The prevalence of late onset and child onset by informant. So when it was the 25-year-old answering the question, the questionnaires, 14% of them indicated that they had late onset. Child onset, though, only 9%. When parents were answering, that's 5.9%. When parents were answering the questionnaires on behalf of their children, you can see that the rates didn't change here much. I'm using my cursor. They're basically around 5% prevalence rates. The research also looked at these risk factors that I talked about earlier, genetics, and LO being late and CO being child. The genetic risk was very, very similar. And then also looking at birth, the early birth and low birth rate, there was no strong difference between the two. Childhood resources, internal resources were considered the cognitive abilities that were tested using verbal and reading. For those with late onset, those abilities were high. Child onset, they were low. And external childhood resources, things like the family income and the mother's education. So those were both high for the individuals that the symptoms developed later in life, and those resources were considered low when it was child onset. So the key findings of the research is that regardless of the questionnaire, remember there were two, regardless of the way that they represented ADHD and measured ADHD, the operations, or regardless of whether it was the parent answering on behalf of the child or the actual individual answering at the age of 25, high levels of ADHD symptoms were reported as beginning after childhood. So that's after the DSM-5 cutoff of 12 years of age. It also indicated that the late onset age is more likely to be young adult as opposed to adolescent. Now, the researchers indicate, or the researchers hypothesize that this is because the older the individuals get, the less access they have to family resources. Symptom comparisons across informants indicate the potential for both internal and external resources to compensate or scaffold and therefore delay ADHD symptoms. The hypothesis was actually supported that ADHD, whether it be late or child, do actually have the same composition, i.e., that is, they are the same disorder. Late onset ADHD is associated with higher childhood resources. So just quickly, the strengths of this research, it was a large sample size. There were many data point collections done. It was published in a high quality journal, and they also addressed limitations that had been previously highlighted in past research. Limitations, though, the most important of which, they used ADHD symptoms instead of the DSM-5 diagnosis. The family income was only measured once, and there were also analytical limitations that took place. What now? There are practice and also research considerations that I have highlighted there, particularly for practice. Don't eliminate ADHD based on age. And then also research to actually look at other external factors such as parenting practice, attitude, and willingness to investigate a diagnosis on the parents. Replication in other ethnic groups. Thank you very much. Stop.